All right, welcome back to the second half. Next speaker is Jeff Miley. He's a lecturer in political sociology at the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. He was a Garza Peleo Fellow in Madrid. His research interests include comparative nationalisms, the politics of migration, and democratic theory. So, over to you.
Thank you very much. So it's an honor to be here and talking about the Kurdish question, and in particular talking about the model of democratic confederalism, both in theory and in practice. I had the fortune of being a member of the academic delegation that was invited to Rojava in December and participated in that, so I got to see a lot of what was going on the ground, sort of as an embedded academic, so to speak. And I think it's a very important thing that's happening in Rojava. It's important for those of us on the left generally who are thinking about ways in which we can articulate an alternative that is somehow viable and desirable to the capitalist tyranny and the imperialist tyranny in the era of the war on terror. I think what's being practiced in Rojava is effectively a redefinition and a rearticulation of self-determination in a way that moves beyond. I coincide with Yus very much. It moves beyond and grows out of a critique of the limits of the movements of national self-liberation in a way that that we can go back to and think about recuperating a left tradition that is overcoming many of the more negative aspects of the legacy of Leninism in particular, and so rethinking Marxism and rethinking revolutionary radical politics post-Leninism, let's say. So with respect to the question of self-determination and its relationship to national liberation movements, I think I want to begin by talking about these, by mentioning this point about the limits to the national self-liberation, the national self-determination movements, as articulated by Julius Nyerere, who was the first president of Tanzania, and I think a very important figure who was able to articulate early on what I think are many of the issues that Öcalan as well has dealt with in a different context, and the democratic confederal model is providing a substantive answer to. So when Nyerere says, everyone wants to be free, and the task of the nationalists is simply to rouse the people to a confidence in their own power of protest. But to build the real freedom which socialism represents is a very different thing. It demands a positive understanding and positive actions, not simply a rejection of colonialism and a willingness to cooperate in non-cooperation. So this is something that I want to advance the idea that the democratic confederal model that has been advanced in theory by Öcalan and cadres associated with the PKK to one degree or another is an alternative understanding of self-determination, and one that helps move beyond some of the limits of the understanding of national self-determination as a right to an independent nation state. So the revolution in Rojava, what is the democratic confederal model? We've talked about it, but let me just begin by sketching what are the main components of it for those of you who may not be as familiar with it. And I'll do so by beginning by quoting Salah Muslim Muhammad, who's co-president of the Democratic Union Party, which is at the front of the revolutionary forces in Rojava. What he has to say, he says, "We have created in the middle of the civil war in Syria 3 independent cantons in the Rojava region that function by democratic autonomous rule. Together with the ethnic and religious minorities of the region, Arabs, Turkmen, Assyrians, Armenians, Christians, Kurds, we have written a collective political structure for these autonomous cantons, our social contract, a sort of revolutionary constitution, so to speak, and one that is specific and explicit in its attempt to incorporate the rights of ethnic and religious minorities and accommodate religious and cultural diversity. So moving beyond an understanding of a homeland conceived in along ethnic national lines. So we have established a People's Council, including 101 representatives from all cooperatives, committees, and assemblies running each of our cantons, and we established a model of co-presidency. Each political entity always has both a female and a male president, and a quota of 40% gender representation in order to enforce gender equality throughout all forms of public life and political representation. So this is another very important dimension of this, along with the explicit emphasis on cultural and religious accommodation and pluralism, a particular emphasis on gender emancipation, which we talked about before, this gender emancipation being at the heart of the Rojava Revolution as well. And linked into this is this idea of what is being implemented in here is a notion of democracy without the state. So he says, we have in essence developed a democracy without the state. That is a unique alternative in a region plagued by the internally conflicted Free Syrian Army, the Assad regime, and the self-proclaimed Islamic State. So this idea of democracy without a state, what does this mean? This is an idea that has a deep tradition of advocacy on the left, on the revolutionary left in particular, and it's an alternative notion of democracy from the representative democratic form, which has come to monopolize the way that people talk about democracy in the international community, and particularly linked into American foreign policy and the American foreign policy agenda. So this democracy without a state, sometimes referred to as democratic confederalism, other times as democratic autonomy. What does it mean? Let me just quote Muslim Muhammad once more. He says, democratic autonomy is about people understanding and exercising their rights, to get society to become politicized. That is the core of building democratic autonomy. In Europe, you will find a society that is not politicized. Political parties are not only about persuasion and persuasion and individual benefits, not about actual emancipation and politicization. So linked into this project is a reflexive critique of the democratic representative model of the so-called advanced capitalist countries. So he says real democracy is based on a politicized society. If you go now to Kobane and you meet the fighters of the YPG and the YPJ, you will find that they know exactly why they are fighting and what they are fighting for. They are not there for money or interest. They are there for elementary values, which they practice at the same time. There is no difference between what they do and what they represent. Okay? So this idea of a radical, politicized, revolutionary discipline associated with politicization, collective mobilization. And this is what you really see in this war-torn zone. And this notion of active participation and an active, radical democratic view, I think, is something that is an emancipatory understanding of democracy that pushes it beyond what we can consider to be just a mere political emancipation understood as a nation state, for example, or rights within a nation state. And this goes back to the Marxist critique of political emancipation. I think in this respect, the forces in Rojava are true to a Marxist vision of what human emancipation would look like when he critiqued as early as 1844 in On the Jewish Question the notion of political emancipation. So he says, so let me just remind us about what Marx has to say about this. He says, where the political state has attained its true development, man, not only in thought and consciousness, but in reality and life, leads a twofold life, a heavenly and an earthly life. Life in the political community, in which he considers himself a communal being, and life in civil society, in which he acts as a private individual, regards other men as a means, degrades himself into a means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. So this notion of political emancipation, understood as having your rights in a bourgeois democratic state, is not enough, because this kind of freedom, according to Marx, led to a kind of bifurcated consciousness. On the one hand, an abstract freedom of the citizen, but in reality, on a day-to-day level, a lack of politicization and tyranny across so many aspects of one's real life existence. So this attempt and this aspiration on the part of the revolutionary forces in Rojava to engage in a process of politicization and mobilization of the entire of the entire citizenry, I think, is speaking to this deeper aspiration, certainly on the revolutionary left, of human emancipation instead of mere political emancipation. And I think this is linked in intimately to this question of what we're striving for is something more than just an independent state. And I think this can be traced back on the revolutionary left to thinking about the problems of mere political emancipation. So linked into this, as I already mentioned, is this project is an internationalist frame of reference in many respects, and particularly comes out, I think, very explicitly in the dimension which is so important, which is the dimension of gender emancipation as part of human emancipation. This has been spoken about already, that theoretically Öcalan has said many very interesting things about gender oppression, and thinking of women's slavery as the most profound and disguised social area where all types of slavery, oppression, and colonization are realized, and theorizing, in fact, women as the first and the original proletariat, so to speak. And this is linked into an internationalist consciousness, and linked into as well the critique of the state. So this is a quote from Sazda Avesin, who was a YPJ commander for a platoon named after the martyr Sehit Peyman in Amude. She said on our trip to Rojava, she said to us, "We are not just women struggling against ISIS, we are also struggling to change mentalities and to show the power of women to the outside world. We also want to be a voice in the search for the emancipation of women around the world. We want to be a voice in the historical struggle of women for freedom. We also want to build a philosophy of life. We don't want the world to know us because of our weapons, but because of our ideas. Our struggle goes beyond Rojava. Our struggle is on a global scale. Those who come to visit us also see that we are struggling to create networks with other women. We want people to know us with our emotions, ideas, colors. War is something we engage in out of necessity, not because we like war." So this idea that this is, it's linked into an internationalist vision of a struggle for women's emancipation in particular. And again, beyond just rhetoric, we see insistence that the revolution in Rojava is a revolution of women. And it's also a revolution, as I say, that speaks to this idea of radical democracy. So an alternative notion of democracy from the institutional representative form. So again, to go back to Salah Muslim Muhammad, what he says, we are engaged in the construction of radical democracy, to mobilize people to organize themselves and to defend themselves by means of people's armies like the People's Defense Unit, the YPG, and the Women's Defense Unit. We are practicing this model of self-rule and self-organization without the state as we speak. Other people will speak of self-rule in theory, but for us, this search for self-rule is our daily revolution. Women, men, all strands of our society are now organized. The reason why Kobane still stands is because we have built these structures. So this idea of this mobilized participatory model that part of the self-government, obviously crucial to the self-government, is self-defense. What kind of revolutionary institutional structure has emerged? I've already begun to describe it a bit, talking about these quasi-consociational mechanisms that are there to assure minority ethnicity, minority religious cultural accommodation, and also there to assure women's participation. But these have emerged in a sense linked into this direct democratic alternative, and this is linked into a notion of a revolutionary rupture being a rupture from the state as form. And this is something that also has a long history on the revolutionary left, going back to Marx, and in particular Marx's writing on the Paris Commune, which I think Just also mentioned. And it's been, and there are other historical instances where something like this form has come into existence in a moment of revolutionary rupture. So what did Marx have to say about the Paris Commune back in 1871? He described it along the following lines, and I think here the analogy is quite for anyone who has been reading up on what's happening in Rojava. It should be striking. The commune, says Marx, was to be the political form of even the smallest country hamlet, and that in the rural districts the standing army was to be replaced by a national militia with an extremely short term of service. The few but important functions which would still remain for a central government were not to be suppressed, as has been intentionally misstated, he says, but were to be discharged by communal and thereafter responsible agents. And here's the most important part, he says, the unity of the nation was not to be broken, but on the contrary to be organized by communal constitution and to become a reality reality by the destruction of the state power which claimed to be the embodiment of that unity, independent of and superior to the nation itself, from which it was but a parasitic excrescence. So this idea of a radical democracy requiring some kind of smashing of the bureaucratic state apparatus, understood as a radical democratization of decision making, and this is what we're seeing in part, with many dilemmas and many contradictions, but nevertheless emergent form of an alternative radical democratic community in Rojava. Now let me just how much time do I have? How am I doing here?
5 minutes.
Okay, good. So let me just end by talking about this question of the role of the nations, the nationalism question in particular, and its link to the question of the critique of the state. Because Öcalan has been, in theory, he's been very insistent on the importance of redefining self-determination so that it is not aligned with a goal for an independent nation state, which for a variety of reasons he thinks is not either viable or desirable. But furthermore, not only the nation state form, but he's also articulated a critique of nationalism. A critique of nationalism, and it's linked into an ongoing commentary about the emergent form, the emergent state form that we see in Iraqi Kurdistan, in the KRG. He said what he has to say about the nationalism. He says, it is unclear, this is in democratic confederalism here, it is unclear which direction the feudal liberal Kurdish national authority in Iraq will take in the long run, and how it will affect Iran, Syria, and Turkey. There is the danger of a regional escalation of the conflict similar in shape to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A flare-up of Kurdish nationalism might even radicalize the Persian, Arab, and Turkish nationalists further, making a solution to the problem more difficult. Okay? So this idea of a flare-up of Kurdish nationalism could actually lead to a conflagration and a conflicting nationalisms, and an idea to transcend nationalist, a nationalist imaginary and a nationalist project altogether. And this being linked into a principled and not merely tactical disavowal of the goal of a nation state. Along the lines, again in democratic confederalism, he says, the call for a separate nation state results from the interest of the ruling class or the interest of the bourgeoisie, but does not reflect the interest of the people, since another state would only be the creation of additional injustice and would curtail the right to freedom even more. And here, in this articulation, I think Öcalan goes I like to think of it as going back to the future, so to speak, goes back to before Lenin's the institutionalization and the turn into a dogma on the revolutionary left about self-determination understood as a right to an independent state goes back to something, an articulation that's closer to Rosa Luxemburg's, in fact. Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the doctrine of self-determination understood in particular as a right to an independent nation state. Let me remind, again, the words of Rosa Luxemburg, what she had to say about self-determination, and again suggests that it is very similar to what Öcalan is articulating here. So Luxemburg says in 1909 in The National Question and Autonomy, she says, the formula, the right of nations to self-determination, gives no practical guidelines for the day-to-day politics of the proletariat, nor any practical solution of nationality problems. And furthermore, she says, a general attempt to divide all existing states into national units and to retailor them on the model of national states and statelets is a completely hopeless and, historically speaking, reactionary undertaking. So this is from 1909, Rosa Luxemburg. Now let me just end by going back to how Öcalan conceives of this model of democratic confederalism and how it's linked into a broader project for the Middle East more generally, and at least the Middle East, if not on a global scale, a model understood. So he says, how do we conceive of this model of democratic confederalism? It's a model for the entire Middle East. He says, this model is suitable for the building of federal administrative structures in all Kurdish settlement areas in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. Thus, it is possible to build confederate structures across all parts of Kurdistan without the need to question existing borders. The citizens must be invited to actively commit themselves for democracy. And he says, crucially, he says, the minorities living in Kurdistan must be invited to participate as well. So this notion of the minorities having to participate. He also insists on the right to native language education being warranted, and considers this has to be linked into a project for real democratization throughout the entire Middle East. Well, understanding that the Middle East is a particular region whose borders were configured by imperialist powers for imperialist reasons, and the borders themselves are seen to be by strong parts of populations across the different states as, in many respects, imperialist impositions, and the memories of those imperialist impositions have not died out in that region of the world. In that respect, I think it's an interesting theoretical articulation. I'll just end on this, and we can talk about in question and answers more about the practical limits on the ground linked into the isolation of the revolution and the question of whether or not the revolution can sustain itself without spreading. But think about I want to end with a particular point about a kind of pragmatism in Öcalan's thought, because even though Öcalan's thought is linked into a radical critique of stateness as such, he also mentions that in the short term, now in Rojava, of course, because of the civil war, the state collapsed. And so it created a revolutionary opportunity that elsewhere in other parts of Greater Kurdistan does not exist. And he says in those other places, it's not practical to believe that the state is going to vanish anytime soon. In which case, then his policies for multi-ethnic and multicultural accommodation actually are, in many respects, strangely have affinities with much mainstream political scientific debates about overcoming a nation state form in form of other kinds of multinational federal democracies, or people like Juan Lintz and Al Stepan have talked about thinking of a state nation. And there's interesting kind of affinity between this notion of a state nation as opposed to putting the nation at the center. You have around the state and the democratic institutions of the state in particular being a focus for loyalty. And so let me just talk about that more pragmatic affinity between this multicultural, multi-ethnic program and these broader notions that across the board arguing for federalization and moving beyond nationalism to saying policies that recognize the legitimate public and even political expression of active sociocultural cleavages, active multicultural, multi-ethnic commitments and the like. There's actually an interesting convergence there in Öcalan's thought and also on the ground. So I'll leave it at that and come back to it in questions and answers.